The final report from the Abuse and Care Royal Commission of Inquiry was released publicly last Wednesday, the 24th of July. The report reflected on evidence gathered throughout the inquiry, and it detailed the nature of abuse, the extent of impact that it has had on survivors, what has been done to stop it, and what further changes are needed to ensure it never ever happens again. The church has been implicated in much of what has been released. Joining us now is Dr. Rocio Vigoria. I'm so sorry, and I apologize, Dr. Rossi, if I've got your name pronounced it incorrectly. A Catholic sexual abuse survivor and theologian who researches theological and pastoral responses for survivors of church sexual abuse. Again, we say good morning.
Morena, good morning.
Morning.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Rocio. And can I first just say thank you for being a voice for, I imagine, what is a very large number of people, and probably the true extent of it we'll never really be able to uncover. But, you stand in a very difficult place and speak for a lot of people who wouldn't have a voice for themselves or are unable to even maybe confront what's happened to them in their past. So thank you, and we really appreciate your time this morning.
Yeah.
To start with, could you give us just a kind of an overview of like the key findings of this report?
Yes. So really the results have been a little bit appalling, shocking. 200,000 out of 655,000 people in care were abused between 1950 and 2019. The abuse extends all types of abuse. So we talk about physical abuse, psychological abuse, spiritual abuse, sexual abuse, and actually torture in healthcare institutes. It is very also sad, the fact that the most harmed and most vulnerable have been children, Maori people, Pacifica people, and women, and disabled people. So the commission reported more or less also that there were more than 592 perpetrators of abuse in the Catholic Church, for example. So it has also been found that there were more sexual abuse in the churches than in care state settings. So it is really, the stories are heartbreaking. I have been reading one by one the stories. I have not finished. It's very, very large number of survivors that have come to the commission to report their abuse, like more than 2,500 people. So the stories are horrific, are layers and layers of abuse, all types of abuse.
We can't even imagine the situation or your story, Dr. Rocio. But before we go on to ask questions around how the church has been responding to some of these reports, Bjorn mentioned at the very start, we thank you for being a light and being a voice for those who may have had their voice quietened over this period of time. Have you had many people approach you about being that voice, and what impact has that had on you as an individual in your study as well? And the hope that you can provide others?
Yes, really, it is something, it's a very hard topic to work with. I really didn't look for it because it's so hard, but as I am a survivor of abuse, when I went public, it was like in 2012, I was really public. I went into television and I denounced. I was the whistleblower of a community and the founders who were abusers, and one of them abused me when I was really, really young. This was in Peru. I am Latin American, and then I came to New Zealand. And from the time I went public, lots of people, lots of victims became coming to me to tell their stories, to look for support, to ask for advice. And really, I became like a point of reference for them, for many of them, from all over the world, I have to say, from all over the world. And this, I feel it now like a mission. I feel it like really, I feel that this, because of what happened to me, I am able now to help others to understand what they have lived, to be a voice for them. So it's a little bit like the sense of my life now.
I spoke to a man just a couple of years ago in Rotorua, who I met outside a Salvation Army, and we got talking, and he literally just at that point had finished just giving his testimony into this Grand Commission of Inquiry, and he had told his story and come forward, and he said it was the first time in his life he'd ever spoken about it. And this man would have been in his late 50s, I reckon. And he said for him it was the hardest thing he'd ever had to do because he'd never told anybody about what he went through. And he said as he spoke about it and told his story and they recorded it, he said it helped him even understand so many of the problems that he's faced in his life with issues with addiction and all kinds of things that have really, not led him down the best path. He's like, I started to realize maybe where a lot of that had come from. So it's, we know a lot about abuse and trauma having obvious ongoing detrimental effects to people for extended periods of time. With this report coming out showing the scope of it and how horrible and terrible it's been, what has the report said about how churches have dealt with this kind of thing in the past? Like, how have they responded to the abuse previously?
Yeah, that's also the very sad story, and really terrible, the fact that the churches who have the mission to protect people have done the contrary. Because I think, the report calls it a national disgrace, all what has happened. But I would say that what happened to the churches was a ecclesial disgrace, has been a church disgrace. Because not only they didn't believe the victims, so from all this period, from decades and decades, they didn't believe the victims when they come forward, or they denied, or actually they were more worried to cover up, to defend the image of each church than to look for justice and redress. And that's also part of the stories. When you read the stories of the reaction of the different churches and the authorities, is useless, is helpless, is just bad, really bad. So that's also, and also there are lots of factors that have enabled this abuse to happen in churches. That because the sexual abuse is not just about sex, it's about abuse of power. So many of these leaders have used their spiritual power, the position in power or leadership that they have, to use it for their own interests, to harm other people and not to protect them. So, and also I would say in the moments of redress, the compensations have been very small and insignificant. When, as you say, the consequences of the abuse is terrible. They say that it's one of the most difficult traumas that a person can live. And the consequences are post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety, addictions, can be problems in relationships. People who have been abused do not trust anymore. So really, it's life consequence, and there is no sum or money that can compensate that. But I think we can help them. We can really compensate it financially in a way that can support them in their lives. But that has not been done by the churches, and that's a problem.
We'll get to how can we make sure survivors feel heard and compensated or supported or seen. But now that you've also highlighted and addressed the fact that the church has failed these victims, where do we move? How do we move forward as a church now then? What's your recommendation there?
Look, the report has given incredible good recommendations that I think we have to implement them. So the first thing I would say for churches, we have to read the report. Okay, so at least read the summary of the faith-based communities. I would say the first task that all of us, we need as church communities. Because first of all, we need to understand the problem. We need to understand the harm that we have done. If we do not understand what is sexual abuse, what is abuse, how the factors that enable abuse, we cannot go forward. So we need to understand first the problem. Second, I think we need to begin implementing the recommendations. So there are of course, we have to wait to the government because they are talking about a national care strategy to prevent and respond to abuse in care. But for example, they are asking for apologies from the churches, apologies from the Pope, different apologies. They are asking also very practical things that we can do, eliminate or public honors, memorials, street names of abusers or perpetrators. There is something that is very concrete because victims feel re-victimized when they see the names of these perpetrators like having honors and be praised. Another thing that they talk is about also training people, training our leaders, having also supervisors for priests, catechists, ministers, having people who supervise them that are independent from the institution. So yes, there is and also they do the recommendations regarding the systemic factors that enable abuse. So, for example, they say that in many churches there are theologies that are not healthy and can enable abuse. For example, the vision of women, the perspective that undervalue of women and making women like a second citizen in the different churches, and the abuse of power, the abuse of authority. So all those. The report also talks about patriarchal narratives in which the women feels subdued or submissive, and does not help, and actually it enables abuse.
I like what you said about the first step is, literally just reading the report. Because if you don't understand your past, you don't understand your future, and if you don't, you can't fix a problem that you don't really know the full extent of it. So, although an extremely difficult read, and very confronting and painful, I imagine for a lot of people to read through, very worthwhile, especially if you're a church leader or someone in that sort of position to know what's gone on in the past. And we can't really pretend that this doesn't still go on. I mean, I know the report goes till 2019, but that doesn't mean that's the date where things ended. There'll still be horrible stuff happening even to this very day. So what can, we're a Christian radio station. I imagine there's a number of people listening that are probably in churches, in leadership in churches around New Zealand, tuned in this morning. What can we do, maybe even in smaller churches, to create an environment where people feel like they can bring forward their concerns or their own experiences, where they feel like they'd be able to speak up? Like, have you got anything advice you could point to around that sort of space?
Yes, I think one problem that also the report mentions is the fact that we do not talk about violence, in our churches. And I think it's true. You do not listen in a catechesis, in a preaching, in a homily about domestic violence, about abuse. So when you cannot talk about something, you are silent. If you normalize the topic, people feel, okay, we can talk about this. I can talk about my experience. So first thing, we need to address the topic of violence, all types of violence in our churches as a part of the narrative. Second, I would say that the problem is also that for many cultures and for churches, sexuality or sex has been a taboo topic. So you have children or young people that they don't have any education about anything, just do not do that, but not about how to protect themselves, what are their feelings, what are the like talking about sex and sexuality. So when in many cultures also, Pacifica people were saying, and more people, that sex is a taboo topic. So you also feel that you cannot talk if you have been abused. So we have to address also the topic of sexuality and sex within the churches. I would say also that we have to use tools to make it easier, because if you, for example, what we do, I have been doing workshops in Africa with women, that also for African women, it's a taboo topic to talk about sexuality and abuse, because they feel shame. So what we did is we did a Bible works, biblical workshops. And we told the stories of the Old Testament. There are many stories of rape or terrible stories. And if you read it from the Bible, You say this happened in the scriptures. We have in the Bible terrible stories of rape and abuse. And the women were able to say, oh, this happened also to me. Oh, I have heard this happen in my community. So also using the scriptures, because it's like we have eliminated those stories of the scripture, like it didn't happen, but actually did happen. And as you said, it continue happening. It's not that it has the abuse have finished in 2018.
Absolutely. Finally, from us, what advice would you give to survivors who are trying to navigate their own healing journey, and within the actual context of their own faith as well? Because that would be very confronting for a lot of them and polarizing and hard to navigate.
Absolutely. Look, every person, every survivor has their own path, and their own story and their own pace. Usually when you are a survivor from a religious context, it's very hard. One of the consequences is a spiritual consequence. You lose your faith. I have so many friends that are survivors and they have lost their faith. They cannot enter to a church anymore because it's a place where they were abused, and they feel that the abuse, that God didn't protect them. So first of all, not to blame them. And they have also not to blame themselves for having these feelings. They have to do just a healing journey, and the most important thing is to have people who support them, first of all. So good friends, good relatives that can support them. Psychotherapy is very important, necessary. Speak up with a person who will and do this confronting, but not necessarily at their own pace, because it's too hard. So little by little, and be very patient, and accept all those terrible feelings as anger, resentment, hate, because it's also part of the healing process. Sometimes we want to jump to resurrection, but sometimes we have to stay also in the Holy Saturday, between the death and the resurrection. And for survivors, it's a little bit like that. Sometimes we have to stay for several years between death and resurrection.
Dr. Rocio Figueroa, we appreciate your time this morning. And as we highlighted at the very beginning, thank you for being a voice of hope and light for those victims who are still trying to process what's been happening. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you.